Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name's Brian, and in this video we're going to be analyzing Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, as a commander, and then we're going to be building a list that is centered around taking advantage of what Loras Tyrell brings to the table. So recently I had a video for Stannis Baratheon, the One True King, come out. I do feel like when it comes to discussing Baratheon lists, if you talk about a Stannis thing, you have to talk about a Renly thing eventually, like at least close together, because it's almost like that parenting style where like one kid has a birthday and then you have to buy the sibling something for the birthday too, just so they don't feel like left out. I think that's kind of how it works with Baratheon people. But don't worry, Targaryen people, you're coming up soon here, so you won't have to worry about me kind of glazing over a lot of the Targaryen stuff. Let's take a look at Loras's cards that he brings to kind of get an idea of what his gist is and see where we have to take the army from there. The first card that we have is Loved by the Small Folk. This triggers when a friendly combat unit activates. If they happen to be within short range of Loras's unit, they roll +1 attack die and gain Sundering. So the Baratheon units that are more geared towards survival, they don't seem to have the greatest combat output. So this card at face value looks really interesting. Getting an extra attack die and gaining Sundering helps them push across some damage, so they're not just kind of chipping away at your opponent's units, even if those units aren't the most survivable thing in the world. The only real issue with this card is that that unit has to be within short range of Loras's unit, and that means that you kind of have to brick up, if you're familiar with that term. Essentially what that means is your units kind of have to play close together to a single anchor point in order to get some of these buffs. This one, now short range from his unit, if you happen to be playing like a more central scenario, keeping Loras's unit in the middle is probably gonna, it covers a pretty decent size of the table. I think it's got to be 17 inches in a circle, I think the way that is it. Yeah, I think that's the way that'll work, about 17 inches roughly. I mean, the front side's going to be shorter, but that's kind of like the bubble. So it shouldn't be too hard to get this card to go off, but there are going to be some spots where you just won't be able to get it, even though you might want it. The next card we have is Growing Strong. This triggers when a friendly NCU claims a zone, and you get to replace that zone's effect with restoring up to 3 wounds and removing up to 2 condition tokens from any number of friendly combat units. Usually, I am not a super huge fan of replacement cards from commanders or replacement tactics board cards from commanders. I think that if we look at something like Sudden Charge from the Stark Tactic deck, that one feels like the pinnacle of replacement effects, but Growing Strong is pretty decent also. Sometimes, especially in our triple NCU for everyone environment that we happen to be in right now, being able to grab a not super important zone that's just open for you and using this card to replace it to give you a better effect, especially if your opponent's kind of swiped out the healing zone from you or the coin zone. This could be pretty beneficial to that. And I think that given the type of list that we're going to be building, your opponent's going to be more likely to try and get some of these vulnerable tokens out on you to break some of our good defense saves. So I don't think this card is a complete and utter potato, but it's not always something that I like seeing in commander cards. Although I do think this one has some good application with the list we're going to look at. The final card that Loras brings is Overgrowth. This triggers when a friendly combat unit makes a melee attack before the attack dice are rolled. For each enemy rank destroyed by that attack, this unit can restore D3 wounds. So this one's a little bit on the corner case side. It's not going to be something that you're going to be looking at throwing out there right away. You're probably going to have to take a couple combats in order to get a unit to fall down a rank just based on some of the units that you look at. I think the big thing is like a lot of the Baratheon units, or not a lot, but ones that we're going to be taking most of, they hit on 4s and they don't throw a ton of attack dice, even though it's probably a little bit more above the curve for small units. But this one is a little wonky. It's nice to push the extra damage across, but I don't know if I have the utmost confidence in being able to make sure that we're going to get those D3 is probably one of my biggest problems with this card in general, is that there's a good chance that it does nothing. You don't really get to see the outcome to plan for it. You just kind of have to play this card, pick up your dice, cross your fingers, and hope several things go the way you want them to. You need to roll well enough to take out a rank. Your opponent needs to roll poorly enough to take out a rank, and then maybe you get your panic test in there to sharpen some other wounds down on the unit. So its Overgrowth is probably a better card than what I give it credit for, but at least to me, this seems like there's a lot of things that need to happen in order to make it work. Now that we've seen what Loras brings to your tactics deck, let's see what Loras brings to the table. He is an on-the-table commander, so that already has plenty of benefits on it just for scoring purposes, but the only real ability that he brings is Expert Duelist. This is just a rule that says each time this unit makes a melee attack against an enemy infantry unit, it deals 1 additional wound. If there is an attachment in that unit, you may instead roll a die. On a 3+, you just kill that attachment outright. He does have the loyalty Renly Baratheon, which is not a shocker, but that's the only thing that he brings. But that ability is quite nice. I think we might be seeing things like Expert Duelist losing a little bit of their impact. I think people are trying to really maximize their combat units right now, and that does mean that we're going to be seeing less attachments getting put into units. I think Starks we'll still see a bunch of it, and it's not to say that we're not going to see attachments anymore, period. It's just that oftentimes you get to this tipping point in a list where if you want 5 combat units and you want 3 NCUs, which is just that have your cake and eat it too scenario, you're going to be cutting some corners, and a lot of those corners come from tearing down your attachments. It is really nice to have an Expert Duelist that is actually going to be played with. I know that Jaime Lannister can do this, but we're not really seeing a whole lot of him in either of his variants. So seeing Loras on here doing stuff is going to be great. I know that Ygritte kind of does this too, but she's going to probably be more commonly seen on the NCU board of things and not so much in a unit. But getting Expert Duelist for free is extremely powerful in the right situations. You just want to make sure that you're kind of lining this unit up to go after your opponent's units that happen to have those really valuable attachments that you want to take off. So Loras seems to support this just attrition-based style of play, which isn't too uncommon for Baratheons in general. They want to survive, and they want to be able to take down their opponent as efficiently as they can. Sometimes that efficiency isn't always there, but Loras does have the cards to kind of help that happen. Expert Duelist does quite a bit to try and take away a lot of the tools your opponent might have with a particular unit to make them less likely to bounce back on the attrition side. And Overgrowth and Healing, Overgrowth and Growing Strong, they're all aspects of just trying to push that attrition, whether it's pushing the damage side of it or you're trying to push the healing side and sustainability from getting rid of those condition tokens. So what kind of unit do we want to put Loras in? There's quite a few options from the Renly side that we can use. I mean, it's just the same as it would be from Stannis. It's one of his specialty units and then all of the vanilla ones and then neutrals. But for Loras, I think he can get plugged into just about any unit you would want to, and he'll be fine. But the way that I want to tilt this list is really lean in on the long-term attrition. We're going to be playing the long game on this one for sure. So the first unit I'm going to grab are the Rose Knights. Now the Rose Knights are a pricey unit at 7 points, and they are pretty slow. They're basically like elite Baratheon Wardens in a sense. They have that 3+ save. They're speed 4, so they're not getting everywhere they want to be as quickly as they want to. They have a 6+ morale, which is pretty decent, but you're still at a point where you might be failing a few tests here and there depending on what you're going into. Their attack stat leaves them hitting pretty accurately on a 3+, and they throw a ton of dice when they're at full ranks. That 8 is really nice for them, but their decay is pretty steep, going from 8 to 5 to 3. Having Loras in this unit to get that extra wound across when we're not going to be utilizing Expert Duelist is going to be really helpful to increasing their output. And when we give them something like the +1 attack die and Sundering, loved by the small folk, that's going to be extremely helpful for this unit to get itself out of any situations that it might be stuck in for too long. They do like getting stuck in combat, but again, on their own terms, right? We want to be just deleting units, but we know that we can sustain them. The Rose Knights also happen to come with 3 different rules on them, so it's pretty potent unit for that 7 points. This is where you're seeing a lot of those points come through. The first one is Perseverance and Valor. Each time this unit makes a melee attack before rolling the dice, it can restore 1 wound. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it can go a long way considering we do have some other healing elements in the list, and making sure that you can get extra attacks with the Baratheon deck means that you could be healing a couple wounds before they even get to activate, or maybe even throughout an entire turn. The next rule they have is Dauntless. Each time this unit passes a morale test, it may restore a wound. So again, at 6+ morale, we're likely to pass most of our morale tests if they're not really modified or anything, but being able to restore that wound from making your attacks and restoring wounds from passing morale tests makes this unit very survivable and will make it to the long game. The last one, which is a really important rule when we're looking at the other 2 that we've talked about, is Deadly Bloom. Each time this unit restores wounds, one enemy it is engaged with can suffer, well, not can, but will suffer 1 wound. Now we take a look at Perseverance and Valor and Dauntless. We're healing wounds when we're attacking, and we're healing wounds when we're attacked most of the time. Deadly Bloom makes sure that we're pushing across extra damage in ways that supersede attacking. So if our opponent might have, in the rare circumstance, they have like one wound left in a unit somewhere that's attacking Rose Knights, more likely than not, they'll just lose that before the Rose Knights can even activate, and lets them get out of combat and go where they want to. They've got the ability to heal that wound on the morale test, so it works for them quite well. There are a ton of NCUs that can be that we can lean into that have some extra healing potential. So every time these guys restore wounds, and it's not every time they restore each wound, it's just when they restore wounds. So if you do something like bring Tycho, where he can do his once per game restore 5 wounds to a unit, if you try to do that with the Rose Knights, you're not going to be delivering 5 wounds to your opponent's engaged unit. You're only going to be healing, you can heal up to 5, right? But you're only going to deal 1 because it doesn't count the individual heals that you get off of this. But it's still a powerful thing to keep in mind when you're looking at how you want to bring these units back up, especially when we look at growing strong. That allows us to spread those heals around and make sure that we're getting the Rose Knights to trigger as much as we want to. The other thing about this list is we are adding a second unit of Rose Knights. No attachment in this one. It's just going to kind of be running around, being annoying and doing the same thing that Loras' unit would be doing, just to a very slightly less effective account, only because Loras isn't in the unit. And I don't know how I really would be normally spreading these out. I'd like to have the Rose Knights with that 3+ to hit standing next to each other, but that allows my opponent to kind of maneuver around them so they can avoid the big blob of these guys. So definitely deploy them in a way where the other set of Rose Knights is very much within that short range of Loras, so that when we do Loved by the Small Folk, we can kind of put that where we want to. For the rest of the units that we're adding to this list, we're not really reinventing anything here, and we're not being extremely creative when we go with this one. We're adding in 3 units of Baratheon Wardens, and the reason being is that they're inexpensive at 5 points, and they've got that 3+ save, and I've talked, I think, ad nauseum at this point about how the Baratheon Wardens are kind of equal part offensive and defensive unit. They really symbolize kind of what the Baratheons do at their core. They like to exist for a long time, and they like to be able to push combat a little bit into their favor, and that kind of happens with the Warhammer rule and the target opening that they have on them that allows them to utilize the weakened tokens that they put out as vulnerable tokens. Now, growing or Loved by the Small Folk is something that's really going to help these guys out. Although with a 4+ to hit, I'd have to be in a really specific situation in order to want this card going on them. I've stated in the past that I think one of my favorite attachments to put on Wardens is the Stormcrow Lieutenant. If there were any changes you wanted to make to this list in terms of what my NCU setup looks like and when I get to it, I think that's one where you might want to wiggle a little bit. But at current, the list stands with 3 vanilla Baratheon Wardens, and that also kind of puts us in this situation where we're kind of gear checking our opponent. If this is in your pairing, your opponent needs to look at it and see that you've got 5 units that are extremely survivable with that 3+ save, and when we get to the NCUs, there's also some pretty dangerous ones in there as well. So they end up trying to look for lists that can break that kind of armor, because under a massive amount of activations, chances are you'd have to throw so many hits and wounds into this unit that have good modifiers on them to be able to start denting it, especially since you'd have to kind of prioritize whether you're attacking or using the NCU board. And as soon as you do something like take the swords on turn 1 just to get that extra activation out of it, it allows the Baratheon player to sweep up the healing zone and get those wounds back into that unit. So they kind of time walk you in that they roll back the clock in terms of whatever you did on your first turn's activation isn't going to really affect the Baratheon player a lot. So when we look at this list on paper, it looks extremely boring, especially when we've got 4 or 5 units that are speed 4. You definitely want to be cognizant of what kind of scenario you're putting these units into, and especially the objective setup if you have the ability to. Like Game of Thrones is probably the example that comes to mind first. You want to make sure that your objectives aren't too far spread out, because you want to be able to kind of clump up in the middle, and you want to make sure that they aren't too far up the table to make sure that your opponent doesn't get to the spicy ones before you do. When we go over to the NCU selections, Baratheons have quite a bit in terms of phenomenal NCUs, and on the Renly side we've got some pretty spicy ones too, but we'll start off with the one that I think any Baratheon list I make is going to have, and that's going to be Shira Errol. And I've talked about her quite a bit too. For the Loras side, being able to vulnerable an opponent when you're trying to heal your units is quite important in trying to push across those wounds when your units might not have the greatest output when we're looking at something like Baratheon Wardens. And being able to remove some of those vulnerable tokens when you're wanting to grab those cards is another helpful thing. But the real reason Shira's in here is because she is just solely a 3-point NCU. The next one we're chasing after is Eldon Estermont. Now, Eldon has the ability Elderly Caution. Whenever he claims the zone on the tactics board, you do replace the zone's effect, or you may, but I'm just trying to drive home here that he replaces zones to do things, but it is a choice that you have. You don't have to do what he's doing. But if you replace the zone's effect, you draw 3 tactics cards and place one of them on the bottom of your deck. This is a fantastic card. The one thing that I don't like about it is that when you draw the 3 cards, you have to place one of the 3 that you draw on the bottom of your deck instead of placing any of the ones that happen to be in your hand on the bottom of the deck. It's just a small bookkeeping thing that I think would probably work better that way, although it does tilt the favor towards the Baratheon player for sure, because then you can just pitch dead cards that you have in your hand. Eldon Estermont makes sure that we can load up on a ton of tactics cards. The Baratheon deck has lots of overlapping triggers, and if you're going to have these things kind of stuffing in your hand, you at least want to be able to burn through your deck and have them all when you need them. There's nothing more frustrating than getting to the late game and hoping that some kind of tactic card draw that you do by taking the zone is going to help you and open up the game and get you out of a sticky situation where all your units are engaged. You're hoping for a last stand or Ours is the Fury or something, and then you just top deck 2 counter charges when they are completely worthless to you. But Eldon Estermont lets you dig through your deck to get those and maybe stuff some of those later game cards onto the bottom, because I think between him and Shira, we should be able to burn through a lot of our deck. Not quite at the rate as a Night's Watch player would, but at least getting pretty close to that. Now our third NCU, so we are living the dream of having 5 combat units and 3 NCUs, but we're bringing Loras Tyrell. Now she's 5 points, and I can definitely see if some people are not super interested in her and want to cut her in order to pad some of those Baratheon Warden units or turn them into something that's a little bit more active in the attacking role. But Loras Tyrell is such a, in my opinion, she's a key piece to this list, because whatever kind of thing your opponent ends up bringing with them to shut down what you're doing or try to control what you're doing, you can just say no to as long as she's getting to activate before they do. Think of things like Walder Frey. We don't want Walder Frey shutting down our Rose Knights. So if we get Olenna on the board early, we can make sure that Walder Frey is not going to mess with our Rose Knights so much. If we have anything else that can really hinder our progress, think of Varys being another one where you can just kind of shut off his little bird's ability for the entire game, or not so much shut them off for the entire game, but at least he becomes, Olenna is kind of the target for him. They're kind of forced to do it, because if you can force the Varys control plays, I think it kind of limits his effectiveness. So Olenna Tyrell is definitely, I don't think she quite compares to Melisandre's impact when we look at each loyalty sides, but I do feel in this list she has her place. And if you're really trying to force your opponent into bad decisions where it's they have to attack all these 3+ armor guys and deal with all the healing, they're going to try and find outs through their NCU, and Olenna kind of puts a stop to that. Probably not so much as like a Courtney Penrose list would, but we definitely get some good benefit to Olenna being in this Loras Tyrell unit, or Loras Tyrell list. Now I know this list is a really diluted experience. The Rose Knights are a really interesting and dynamic unit, and probably not so much dynamic in terms of how they operate on the table, but dynamic in what they do on the table in terms of how they're healing a bunch and doing the wounds and taking a bunch of attack actions that are going to be valuable. But the rest of the list is just a bunch of speed 4 units that are just kind of stumping around and not quite contributing the way that we're used to. But the list is quite powerful, and I think that Loras Tyrell might not be the greatest commander that the Baratheon Renly side has access to, but I think he's worth looking at, and this list definitely kind of tilts towards a lot of his advantages. I think there are definitely ways that you can build him differently, and if you've found any or you've been experimenting with Loras Tyrell, leave a list in the comments section below, because there definitely could be other viewers that are watching this and just really not liking the vanilla taste of the way that this list is presented to them, so it could be helpful to someone else if you happen to have one of these lists up your sleeve. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to making the next one for you.